Take that off. That jacket has no place in my courtroom. The words hit the room like a gavel strike, sharp, deliberate, and mean. And every single person in that courtroom turned to look at the woman standing alone in front of the bench. 32 years old, blonde, quiet, wearing a worn black leather jacket that had seen more road and more heartbreak than most people would ever know. Judge Richard Whitmore stared down at her like she was something he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe, and she just stood there, holding her ground, holding that jacket. If you've ever been judged before you were heard, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment right now telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Victoria Hayes had been in difficult rooms before. She had stood in trauma bays where the air smelled like blood and burning, where machines screamed and people wept, where there was no margin for hesitation and no one to tell her what to do next. She had pressed her hands into wounds and spoken calmly to people who were convinced they were dying. She had done it at 2 in the morning, and she had done it on 3 hours of sleep, and she had done it without anyone ever knowing her real name. She knew how to stand still when everything around her was unraveling. So when Judge Richard Whitmore looked down at her from his elevated bench that Tuesday morning and spoke those words, "Take that off. That jacket has no place in my courtroom." Victoria did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not reach for the zipper. She simply looked up at him and waited. The courtroom itself was the kind of space designed to remind you of your own smallness. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, fluorescent light that turned everyone's skin a shade too pale. The gallery was only half full, a scattering of lawyers checking phones, a few family members pressed together near the back, and 2 journalists who had come expecting a routine assault case and were already sensing something had shifted in the air. Ethan Cole sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed attorney, Dennis Marsh. Ethan was 23 years old with a jaw that looked like it had healed wrong from an old break and eyes that were doing their very best to hold steady. He wore a collared shirt that someone had clearly pressed that morning, and his hands were clasped on the table in front of him like he was holding himself together from the inside. Victoria had spoken to him for exactly 4 minutes in the hallway before the session began. "You okay?" she had asked. "No," he said. "Are you? I've been in worse rooms." He looked at her jacket, then the black leather, the faded stitching, the silver zipper pull that had been replaced twice over the years. His eyes moved to the name stitched in small letters along the inside collar, just visible when the jacket fell open. Silver Angel. He had read it and looked up at her. She had said nothing, because Ethan Cole knew what that name meant, even if he had never been told it directly. He had grown up around people who spoke of Silver Angel the way other people spoke of things they weren't sure were real, reverently, quietly, like the name itself carried weight. Like saying it too loud might disturb something that needed to rest. He had not expected to see that name walking into this courtroom. And now the judge was trying to make her take it off. Dennis Marsh leaned over toward Ethan and whispered something. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his jaw tightened, his hands still clasped on the table pressed harder against each other. Victoria stood at the witness stand. She had not yet been sworn in. Judge Whitmore had stopped the proceeding the moment she entered the moment. He clocked her jacket, and the moment he decided with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been made to feel out of place in a room that she was wrong before she had opened her mouth. "Ma'am," the judge said again. His voice had the particular patience of someone who was not patient at all. "This is a court of law, not a biker rally. You will remove that jacket before you take the stand." Victoria looked at him. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "my jacket has no bearing on the accuracy of my testimony." A soft ripple moved through the gallery, not loud, but present. Judge Whitmore set his pen down. He did it slowly. It was the kind of gesture men make when they want everyone to understand they are choosing not to be angry. "It is a distraction," he said, "and it sends a message to this jury that I am not comfortable with." "What message is that?" Victoria asked. The room got quiet in a different way. Even the journalist stopped typing. Dennis Marsh closed his eyes briefly. The prosecutor, a man named Carl Reese, 45, with a habit of touching his tie when things surprised him, touched his tie. Judge Whitmore's expression shifted. He leaned forward. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "I will hold you in contempt." "I understand that," Victoria said. "I'm still asking the question." She had not come here to make a scene. That was the thing people would misunderstand later when the story spread, when it traveled through the community, the way these stories do told and retold until the sharp edges softened into legend. They would assume she had walked in wearing that jacket as a statement, a challenge, a way of announcing herself. But Victoria Hayes had worn that jacket for the same reason she wore it every time she was somewhere hard, because it helped her breathe. She had owned it for 9 years. She had bought it secondhand from a woman outside a diner in West Texas who had priced it at $40 and thrown in a cup of coffee. The leather had been stiff, then unyielding, smelling of someone else's history. Over the years, it had softened against her body until it fit like something grown rather than purchased. The scars it sometimes covered were older than the jacket, but both of them had been with her on the worst night she had survived. It was not a costume. It was armor of a very particular kind, the kind that worked not because it stopped anything from hitting you, but because it reminded you that you had already survived the last time something did. She had not planned to be here today. 3 weeks ago, she had received a call from Ethan Cole's attorney. Dennis Marsh had explained the situation in the careful, measured language of a man who understood his case was weak and needed a miracle, and was too professionally cautious to call it that. He had medical questions, timing questions. He had heard through channels he chose not to specify that Victoria Hayes might have expertise relevant to the physical evidence. She had asked Dennis directly, "Who told you to call me?" He had paused, then said a mutual contact. She had let it go, because the case itself, once she reviewed the materials, made her stomach go cold. Ethan Cole had been charged with aggravated assault. The supposed victim was a man named Derek Pullman, 41 years old business owner, well-dressed, widely respected in local civic circles. Pullman had appeared at a hospital emergency room with a broken nose and a fractured wrist, and his statement to police described an unprovoked attack by Ethan outside a bar on Creston Avenue. Except that when Victoria looked at the medical documentation, the injury patterns, the timing, the specific fractures, something didn't line up. She had spent 20 minutes with the files and then sat very still for a while, because what the injuries described was not someone who had been attacked. It was someone who had attacked first. The fractures on Pullman's wrist were consistent with a blocking injury, the kind the body produces when someone throws a punch and the intended target deflects it. The nose fracture angle suggested impact from below, not from the forward strike position the police report described. And the contusions on Ethan's body, photographed at booking but barely referenced in the prosecutor's case, told the rest of the story with a clarity that should have been impossible to ignore. Someone had ignored it. Someone with enough authority or enough incentive to shape the documentation that ended up in the court file. Inside the courtroom, Victoria had now been standing at the witness stand for 7 minutes without being sworn in because Judge Whitmore had not moved past the jacket. A bailiff, a heavy-set man named Curtis with a kind face and an uncomfortable job, shifted his weight near the edge of the gallery. He had been quietly signaled by the judge. He was trying to figure out how exactly to do what he'd been silently asked to do without the whole thing becoming something worse. Dennis Marsh rose from his chair. "Your Honor," he said, "the witness is here to offer medical testimony. Her attire does not bear on counselor. Sit down." Dennis sat down. Carl Reese, the prosecutor, was watching Victoria with an expression she recognized. It was not hostility. It was curiosity with a layer of discomfort underneath it. He wasn't sure what she was, and that bothered him more than if she had been something he recognized. "Ms. Hayes," the judge said, "last warning. Remove the jacket or I will have you removed from this courtroom and you will be held in contempt. I will find a way to allow this case to proceed without your testimony." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly but clearly, "My name is Victoria Hayes. I am a registered trauma nurse with 11 years of emergency experience. I am here because a 23-year-old man is being charged with a crime the physical evidence does not support. I will remove this jacket when you can explain to this room why my credibility as a medical professional is diminished by wearing leather instead of a blazer. Until then, Your Honor, with all the respect I am able to give, I would like to be sworn in." She heard someone in the gallery draw a sharp breath. She heard Dennis Marsh make a sound she could not quite categorize, somewhere between pride and terror. She watched Judge Whitmore's face move through several emotions he was trying not to show. And then she heard something else, a sound from the back of the courtroom, the double doors opening. Curtis the bailiff turned first. then the jurors, then the gallery in a slow wave of attention moving from front to back. Marcus Callahan filled the doorway, the way people who are accustomed to commanding space fill every room they enter, not by trying to dominate it, but because something in their bearing simply reorganizes the air. He was 54 years old with a face that carried the record of a life lived without much protection from consequence. Wide shoulders, salt and pepper hair cut close, eyes that had the steady, assessing quality of someone who had learned long ago that the fastest way to navigate any situation was to understand it before you spoke. He wore no jacket. He wore a plain gray shirt, dark jeans, and the kind of boots that had walked 1,000 miles. The absence of visible club insignia in a courthouse was for someone like Marcus a deliberate courtesy, the same way a surgeon doesn't wear scrubs to a dinner party. He understood how spaces worked. He knew how to enter rooms without making them hostile. What he had not planned was what he saw when he got inside. He had come for Ethan. Ethan was one of his young, impulsive sometimes, but with a core of loyalty that Marcus valued above almost any other quality. He had sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before the session, deciding whether to come inside, knowing that his presence might complicate things, knowing that some judges looked at a man like him and made their rulings before the argument was made. But then he had heard through the door a woman's voice, calm, steady, fearless, and something had happened to him that he could not immediately name. He pushed the door open and walked in. He was 3 steps into the courtroom before he saw her, and then he stopped, because he had been looking for this woman for 4 years. I didn't move, not right away. His eyes went to the jacket, then to the woman wearing it, then to the name just barely visible, stitched inside the collar in faded silver thread, Silver Angel. He had heard that name at a warehouse fire 4 years ago, spoken by men who had crawled out of a collapsing building alive when everyone outside had stopped expecting them to. He had heard it again in the hospital where they recovered, whispered in the strange half-awake state of men who weren't sure which parts of what they remembered were real. He had chased that name through every contact he had in 4 states. He had asked at hospitals, at clinics, at biker bars and rest stops, in roadside diners across the entire region. Silver Angel, gone. And now she was standing in a courtroom in a leather jacket holding her ground against a judge who was about to make the worst mistake of his professional life. Marcus moved, not fast, not aggressively. He walked down the center aisle with his hands visible and his pace measured because he understood exactly how this moment looked, and he did not want it to become something it didn't have to be. Every head in the room tracked him. Curtis the bailiff took a step toward him, and Marcus gave him one single look, not threatening, just communicating, and Curtis held his position. He walked to the front of the gallery and stopped at the low wooden railing. And for the first time in 4 years, Marcus Callahan looked directly at the woman called Silver Angel. She had turned when he entered. Her eyes found his and something moved behind them, not recognition exactly because she had never met him face to face, but awareness. She knew who he was, and she understood in the particular way that people understand things before they can explain them, what his presence in this room meant. Marcus spoke, not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. He said, Silver Angel. 2 words, but they landed in that courtroom like a stone into still water, and the rings they made went to every corner of the room. Victoria looked at him, and very quietly she said, You shouldn't be here. No, Marcus agreed, but I've been looking for you for 4 years, and you were standing in a room where a judge was about to hold you in contempt, and I decided I was done waiting in parking lots. The judge's voice broke in. Who are you, and why are you interrupting these proceedings? Marcus turned to the bench. My name is Marcus Callahan, he said. I'm going to sit down right now and let this woman do what she came here to do. I just needed to make sure she knew she wasn't alone in this room. She's been alone long enough. No one said anything, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not Dennis Marsh, who had given up trying to predict this day and was simply letting it happen. Ethan Cole looked at Marcus and something broke open in his face, not weakness but relief. The kind that comes when you have been holding something very heavy for a very long time and someone finally reaches out to help carry it. Victoria looked at Marcus for 3 seconds, then she turned back to the bench. Your Honor, she said, I'm ready to be sworn in. Judge Whitmore looked at her, looked at Marcus, who had settled into a seat in the gallery with the calm certainty of a man who had made his decision and was not revisiting it. It looked at the bailiff, looked at the jury who were watching all of this with the particular quality of attention that juries reserve for moments they understand they will remember. He picked up his pen. "Bailiff," he said. Curtis walked to the witness stand. Victoria raised her right hand, and the case of State versus Ethan Cole moved forward into the hour that would change everything for Ethan, for the judge, for Marcus, and for the woman who had spent 4 years building a quiet life on top of a night she had never spoken about. Because the truth about that warehouse fire, what really happened, what it cost, and who Silver Angel truly was about to come into the light. And some things, once they are in the light, cannot be put back into the dark. But first, the prosecutor was going to try. Carl Reese stood up with the practiced ease of a man who had won more cases than he had lost and believed that trend would continue. He adjusted his tie, not nervously this time, but with the deliberateness of someone putting on a kind of armor. "Your Honor," he said, "before the witness proceeds, the prosecution would like to note for the record that the courtroom has been disrupted by an unauthorized individual, and we would request—" "Mr. Reese," the judge said. "Yes, Your Honor." "Sit down." Reese sat down. The judge looked at Victoria. Something had shifted in his face. It was subtle, the kind of thing that would be easy to miss if you weren't watching for it. But Victoria was the kind of person who watched for exactly this kind of thing, small internal adjustments that told you more about someone's inner state than anything they said aloud. He was recalculating. She had seen it before. Not often, because it required a particular kind of honesty to do it in real time rather than later in private. But she had seen it the moment when a person realizes that their first reading of a situation was wrong, and they have to decide whether to defend the wrong reading or let it go. Judge Whitmore in this moment let it go. Not all the way, not publicly, not yet. But somewhere in the architecture of this proceeding, something had quietly reordered itself. Victoria settled her hands on the railing of the witness stand. She looked at Dennis Marsh. He gave her a small nod. She looked at Ethan. He was watching her with an expression she recognized from hospital rooms, the look of someone who has just been told there might be a way through this after all, and is terrified to believe it. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting in the third row of the gallery with his hands folded and his eyes steady. He gave her nothing, no signal, no encouragement. He simply looked at her the way someone looks when they have absolute confidence in what they are about to witness. Victoria took a breath. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to begin." And she began. She began with the evidence, the medical records, the injury patterns, the forensic details that anyone with her training could read like a language, and that had been deliberately translated into something unreadable in the police report. She walked through it methodically. She used plain words because she had learned that the most important truths should never require decoding. She did not perform emotion. She did not editorialize. She simply told the room what the body of Derek Pullman said had happened on Creston Avenue. And what it said was not what Carl Reese had built his case around. The jury watched her. The gallery watched her. Dennis Marsh took notes with the focused intensity of a man who has suddenly realized his hand might actually win. Carl Reese watched her with his tie straightened and his pen moving and his face doing the thing that faces do when the information they are receiving does not fit the story they have committed to. And Judge Richard Whitmore, the man who had looked down at her leather jacket and decided she had no place in his courtroom, watched her speak for 26 uninterrupted minutes about bone fractures and contusion patterns and injury timelines, and he did not interrupt her once. Marcus Callahan sat in the third row and listened. He had found her, after 4 years, after 100 dead ends, after learning to half accept that Silver Angel was simply someone who did not want to be found. He had found her. And she was exactly what he had known she would be. He had told his brothers after the fire that the woman who had come into that building wasn't someone you simply thanked and moved on from. He had told them that whoever she was, she carried something that couldn't be explained by training and alone, a particular quality of fearlessness that was not the absence of fear, but something else entirely, something harder and more valuable, the ability to act with complete clarity in the middle of the very worst moment. He had spent 4 years looking for her because he owed her a debt that he did not know how to carry without some form of acknowledgement. Not ceremony, not a title, not anything formal, just he needed her to know that it mattered, that the 12 men who walked out of that warehouse went on to live lives, that some of them had kids now, that one of them had gone back to school, that they were still here, still breathing, because of what she had done on a night when doing nothing would have been the reasonable choice. He sat in the third row and watched her take apart the prosecution's case, the way a surgeon removes something that doesn't belong, precisely without drama, with a competence so complete that drama was unnecessary. And he thought, 4 years. She has been out here doing this, just living, just saving people in rooms where no one knows her name. He thought about the name stitched inside her collar, Silver Angel. His people had given it to her. Or rather, they had called her that in the aftermath, in the haze of smoke and shock and gratitude. And the name had stuck because nothing else fit. She had been like something that appeared and then was gone. An intervention that left no trace of itself except the people it saved. Now she was here, and she had walked into this courtroom alone. That was the part that sat in his chest like something heavy. He had spent 4 years trying to find her to say thank you. She had spent 4 years apparently doing exactly what she did at that warehouse, going into hard places for people who needed her and walking away after. He had one question for her when this was over. Just one. He was going to ask her why. At the defendant's table, Ethan Cole watched Victoria Hayes speak and felt the particular sensation of watching someone dismantle something that had been trying to crush you. It was not triumphant exactly. It was something quieter and more profound, the feeling of weightlifting from a place that had grown so accustomed to the pressure that the relief itself felt strange. He had been afraid for a long time. Not of prison exactly. That fear was there, but underneath it was something older and more corrosive, the fear of being seen a certain way and having no way to prove it wrong. The fear that the story someone else told about you would become the only story anyone remembered. Pullman had told a story about Ethan Cole, and Pullman was the kind of man whose stories were believed with his business cards and his civic awards and his clean shoes and the way he looked at juries as if he and they were members of the same club. Ethan was not a member of any club Pullman recognized. Ethan was 23 years old from the east side of the city with a juvenile record that had been sealed but not forgotten, with a family whose circumstances had never given them the kind of credibility that courtrooms extend automatically. He wore the pressed shirt someone had put him in, and he kept his hands on the table, and he had done everything Dennis Marsh had told him to do because Dennis Marsh was his only option, and he was going to trust that option completely. But he had been scared. Until 3 weeks ago when Dennis had told him about a witness. Until Dennis had described a woman who had reviewed the medical evidence and had said to him flatly with no qualification, "This doesn't match the statement." And Ethan had asked, "Who is she?" And Dennis had said, "Someone who knows what she's looking at." I had not known until this morning when she walked into the hallway and he read the name inside her collar that the witness Dennis had found was the person whose name he had heard spoken quietly and carefully his entire life, in circles of people who knew what it meant. Silver Angel. He had not said anything to her about it. He hadn't known how. He watched her now and thought she didn't come here because of the club. She didn't come here for Marcus. She came here because the evidence was wrong, and that bothered her in the way that wrong evidence should bother someone who has spent her life reading the truth that bodies tell. She came for me, he thought, and she doesn't even know me. He wasn't sure he had ever felt anything quite like that. Victoria was most of the way through her testimony when Carl Reese did the thing she had been waiting for him to do. He stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering interpretations that exceed the scope of standard medical testimony and amount to expert analysis for which she has not been qualified by this court." Dennis Marsh was on his feet before Reese finished the sentence. "Your Honor, Ms. Hayes has 11 years of emergency trauma nursing experience, board certification in emergency medicine, and has been published in 2 peer-reviewed medical journals. Her qualifications were submitted to the prosecution 3 weeks ago as part of standard discovery. If Mr. Reese would like to contest her expertise, I'm happy to spend the next 45 minutes establishing it in detail." Reese touched his tie. The judge looked at Victoria. "Ms. Hayes," he said, "are you able to specify the basis for your clinical interpretations?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then continue." Reese sat down, and Victoria continued. She did not rush. She did not become more aggressive in her delivery because she had been challenged. She simply moved forward through the evidence, the same way she moved through any difficult situation, steadily, without wasted motion, with attention to what the moment required. At 11:47 in the morning, she reached the part she had been building toward. She placed her hands flat on the witness stand. The pattern of injury recorded in Mr. Pullman's emergency room documentation, she said, is not consistent with an unprovoked attack. It is consistent with the defensive injuries a person sustains when they have thrown the first blow and encountered effective resistance. The specific fracture on the right wrist, a classic callus presentation, occurs when a strike is deflected by a forearm block. The nasal fracture angle indicates contact from below and at a slight left lateral angle, consistent with an upward strike delivered by someone smaller who was already falling backward. She paused. Mr. Cole is 5 feet 10 inches tall. Mr. Pullman is 6 feet 2. If Mr. Pullman was the one who threw the initial strike, the physics described in the injury pattern align perfectly. If Mr. Cole was the aggressor, as the police report states, the physics do not align at all. The room was completely still. Even Reese wasn't writing. Victoria looked at the jury. I've spent 11 years reading what bodies say about what happened to them, she said. In my experience, bodies don't lie. Paperwork sometimes does. Nobody moved for a long moment, and then from the third row of the gallery, Marcus Callahan exhaled slowly. He had been holding his breath without realizing it. Victoria did not look at him. She was watching the jury, and in the faces of those 12 people she was seeing something shift, the particular transition from uncertainty to understanding that she recognized from hospital rooms, the moment when the information a person has been given finally resolves into a picture they can see clearly. She had done what she came to do. What happened next would happen in the territory of lawyers and judges and the machinery of a legal process she was not in charge of. But the truth was in the room now, and the truth had a way of taking up space. It had a way of making it very difficult for people to proceed as if it weren't there. She sat in the witness stand and waited. And in the worn leather jacket with the name stitched inside the collar, in the courtroom where a judge had told her she didn't belong, Victoria Hayes quietly held her ground, the way she always had, the way she had in the dark, in the smoke, in a collapsing warehouse 4 years ago, when 12 men needed someone to make a decision, and she was the only one close enough to make it. She had not gone back for recognition. She had gone back because people were in there. And that had always been reason enough. Carl Reese did not cross-examine her immediately. He took his time. He shuffled papers. He clicked his pen 3 times. He did the small, deliberate things that lawyers do when they need a moment to rebuild a strategy that has just been quietly demolished. The jury watched him. The gallery watched him. And Victoria sat in the witness stand and waited with the particular patience of someone who has learned that the hardest part of any difficult situation is almost never the moment of impact. It is the moment just after, when everything is still trembling and you have to decide whether to hold your ground or start negotiating with the damage. She held her ground. Reese finally stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at his notes. Then he looked at Victoria with an expression she recognized immediately, the expression of a man who has decided that if he cannot attack the evidence, he will attack the person presenting it. Ms. Hayes, he said, you're a nurse. I am. Not a doctor. That's correct. Not a forensic pathologist. Also correct. Not a medical examiner. Victoria looked at him steadily. Still correct. Reese nodded as if she had agreed with something he was building toward. And yet today, you've offered this court what amounts to a forensic reconstruction of a violent incident based on your interpretation of medical records. Would you say that's a fair characterization? I'd say it's an incomplete one, Victoria said. I offered a clinical interpretation of injury patterns based on 11 years of emergency trauma experience. I didn't reconstruct anything. I explained what the injuries themselves communicate to anyone trained to read them. To anyone trained, Reese repeated, and you are the one determining what that training threshold should be. Dennis Marsh started to rise and Victoria spoke before he needed to. The threshold, she said, is in the board certification, which I have, which was provided to your office 3 weeks ago. A murmur moved through the gallery, short, quiet, but audible. Reese's jaw tightened slightly. Ms. Hayes, let me ask you about your professional background more specifically. You work in an emergency room. Trauma unit, yes. You work with injured people every day, every shift. People who come in and tell you what happened to them. Yes. And you believe them? Victoria paused. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she understood where he was going and she wanted him to get there without any help from her. I assess them, she said. You assess what they tell you. I assess the evidence. What they tell me is part of that, but it's not the whole picture. The whole picture includes what the body shows regardless of what the person says. Reese tilted his head. What the body shows. So you are in your professional practice routinely making judgments about whether patients are telling the truth. I'm making clinical judgments about consistency between reported incidents and physical findings. That's standard practice. And in your judgment, Reese said, the injuries sustained by Derek Pullman are inconsistent with his account of events. Correct. Your judgment. My clinical interpretation. Yes. Reese looked at the jury, then back at Victoria. Ms. Hayes, are you aware of any other medical professional who has reviewed this evidence and reached the same conclusion? The room shifted. Something changed in the air, the particular atmospheric change of a question that has teeth. Victoria looked at Reese. Are you asking whether I am the only person who read the evidence correctly, she said? Or are you asking whether anyone else was allowed to dead silence? Reese blinked. Dennis Marsh set down his pen very carefully. Ethan Cole looked up from the table, and in the third row of the gallery, Marcus Callahan went very still. Because that question, that single question, had just changed the shape of the entire proceeding. Victoria kept her eyes on Reese. Because those are two very different questions, she said, and which one you're asking matters quite a lot. Reese recovered quickly. He was a professional and professionals recover. Move to strike as non-responsive, he said. Overruled, Judge Whitmore said. Reese looked at the judge. Whitmore looked back at him with an expression that had changed since the beginning of the morning. It was the expression of a man who started the day certain of several things and has since become certain of fewer. The witness will answer, the judge said. Reese turned back to Victoria. Ms. Hayes, is there a reason other qualified professionals haven't offered similar testimony in this case? Victoria said, you would need to ask the people who controlled access to the original evidence. And who are those people? I can tell you they aren't in this room, she said. But I can also tell you that the chain of custody documentation for the original emergency room records shows two access events that aren't logged in the standard system, which means someone reviewed documents that later ended up in this court file and that review isn't accounted for. The room erupted. Not loudly, it wasn't a movie courtroom, it was a real one, but the murmur that moved through the gallery was sharp and agitated, and several jurors exchanged quick glances that they immediately tried to suppress because they understood they weren't supposed to be doing that. Reese said, objection, Your Honor. The witness is introducing materials not previously disclosed. They were disclosed, Dennis Marsh said, rising. Exhibit 14, filed 8 days ago. Judge Whitmore held up one hand. The room went quiet. He looked at Dennis. This is the chain of custody documentation you submitted last week. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked at Reese. Mr. Reese, were you provided with Exhibit 14? Reese's hand moved toward his tie and stopped halfway. We received it, Your Honor. The prosecution's position is that the irregularities it identifies are administrative in nature and administrative, the judge said. Yes, Your Honor. Whitmore looked at the exhibit in front of him for a long moment. The courtroom held its breath. Ms. Hayes, the judge said without looking up. How many unlogged access events are recorded in Exhibit 14? 2, Victoria said. The first occurred 6 days after Mr. Pullman's initial emergency room visit. The second occurred 2 days before the police report was finalized. The courtroom absorbed this information in the particular silence of people who are doing the math and arriving at an answer they did not expect to reach. Nobody said anything. Then Reese said very carefully, Your Honor, the prosecution would like to request a brief recess. They got 15 minutes. Dennis Marsh walked to Victoria the moment the jury was out of the room. He leaned against the railing of the witness stand, and he looked at her and he said quietly, You just told a courtroom that the evidence was tampered with. I told a courtroom what the chain of custody record shows, Victoria said. Same thing. Only if the conclusion is correct. Dennis stared at her. Victoria looked at him steadily. 2 unlogged accesses in 8 days, bracketing the period when the medical documentation would have been most useful to shape before it became official court record. You tell me. Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then, who has the access to tamper with hospital records at that level? Someone with authority inside the system, Victoria said. or someone with enough money to reach someone who has that authority. Dennis's voice dropped lower. Pullman. Victoria didn't answer. She was looking across the courtroom at Ethan, who had turned in his chair and was watching the two of them with the focused attention of a person trying to read something important from a distance. How long have you known? Dennis asked. Since I read the chain of custody document the first time, she said. 3 weeks ago. Dennis exhaled slowly. Why didn't you? Because telling you 3 weeks ago that I thought the evidence was manipulated without being able to prove it in a courtroom would have given the prosecution time to prepare a counter-narrative. I needed to say it here in front of the jury where the weight of the record speaks for itself. Dennis looked at her for a long moment. You've done this before. It wasn't a question. Victoria recognized that. I've been in rooms where the truth needed time and positioning to survive, she said. That's different from doing this before. Marcus appeared at the railing. He had moved from this gallery while Reese and Whitmore were conferring at the bench. Nobody stopped him, whether because of his bearing or because the bailiff had made a quiet judgment call. Victoria couldn't say. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her with the same steady, assessing expression he'd had since he walked through the doors. You knew about the tampering before you came in today, he said. Yes, and you came anyway. That's generally how it works, Victoria said. Knowing something is difficult doesn't mean you don't do it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, you haven't changed. She looked at him. You don't know me. No, he said, but I know what you did, and you haven't changed from that. Ethan's attorney touched his arm. Marcus, you need to get back to the gallery before the session resumes. Marcus didn't move immediately. He kept his eyes on Victoria. When this is over, he said, I need to talk to you. We'll see, Victoria said. He held her gaze for another second. Then he nodded a single deliberate motion and stepped back. Dennis watched him go and then turned back to Victoria. Do you know what's about to happen when Reese comes back in that room? He's going to try to discredit the chain of custody document, she said. He'll argue the access logs are system errors. He'll try to make the irregularities sound administrative. And he'll be doing it in front of a jury that just watched him ask for a recess 30 seconds after I described them. Dennis almost smiled. Timing, he said. Timing is everything, Victoria agreed, in trauma medicine and in courtrooms. The recess lasted 22 minutes instead of 15. When Carl Reese came back, something had changed about him. Not dramatically, but Victoria had spent enough years reading small physical shifts in people under pressure to notice a slight stiffness in the way he carried his shoulders, a quality in his movements that suggested he had made several phone calls during those 22 minutes, and at least one of them had gone badly. He had learned something he hadn't known before the recess. Victoria didn't know what, but she would find out. He came back to the podium, and he looked at her, and he said, Ms. Hayes, let's talk about your connection to the defendant. Victoria said, I don't have one. You'd never met Ethan Cole before this case. No. Never had any contact with him, his associates, or members of his affiliated community. Victoria understood the shape of this line of questioning immediately. If you're asking whether I'm connected to the Hells Angels, Mr. Reese, I think you should ask that directly rather than architecturally. Two jurors blinked. One of them, a woman in her 60s with the focused expression of someone who had been paying extremely close attention all morning, made a small movement with her lips that might have been approval. Reese didn't react to the comment the way she expected. He didn't deflect. He looked at her directly and said, Are you connected to the Hells Angels, Ms. Hayes? I know some people, she said. The same way an ER nurse who works in this city for 11 years knows people from every walk of life, including members of outlaw motorcycle clubs, including people from a wide range of communities, yes. Were you asked to testify in this case by a member of the Hells Angels? Victoria said, I was contacted by the defendant's attorney, Dennis Marsh, who was sitting at that table. I was asked to review medical evidence. I reviewed it. What I found is what I've described. And the identity of the mutual contact who referred Mr. Marsh to you. Dennis was on his feet. Objection. Calls for speculation about third-party communications protected under. I'll allow it, the judge said. Ms. Hayes, do you know who referred your name to the defense attorney? Victoria looked at the judge. I asked Mr. Marsh that question directly, she said. He told me it was a mutual contact and declined to specify further. I accepted that answer because it didn't change the nature of the evidence I was being asked to review. Whitmore nodded. Continue, Mr. Reese. Reese took a step. Mrs. Hayes, the jacket you were wearing when you entered this courtroom today, you're aware that it carries significant meaning within motorcycle club culture. Leather jackets have a range of cultural associations, Victoria said. Yes. This specific jacket, the one the court requested you remove. Victoria said, you're going to have to ask a specific question, Mr. Reese. Is that jacket yours? Yes. How long have you owned it? 9 years. And the name stitched inside the collar, Silver Angel. Is that a name you chose for yourself? The room went very still. Victoria said no. Who chose it? She looked at him. People who were in a difficult situation and needed a way to refer to someone they couldn't identify by name. Members of the Hells Angels. People who were in a burning building, Victoria said. I'm not aware of whether all of them held formal club affiliations. I was focused on other things at the time. Reese looked at the jury. You were present at the warehouse fire on Kellner Road 4 years ago. It wasn't a question. He had done his homework during the recess. Or someone had done it for him. Yes, Victoria said. You entered the building. Yes. During an active structure fire. The fire was in its second stage. The structural collapse hadn't fully, she stopped. Redirected. Yes. During an active structure fire. Lone. Yes. And rescued 12 individuals. I helped 12 individuals exit the building, she said. There's a difference. What's the difference? Reese asked. Victoria looked at him. Rescuing implies they couldn't have done it without me. Helping implies I provided something useful in a situation where they were already doing everything they could. They were fighting hard. I just knew the right direction. The woman in the jury box who had made that small movement with her lips earlier made it again. Reese studied Victoria for a moment. She could see him recalibrating in real time, trying to work out whether this line of questioning was helping him or digging something deeper that he hadn't planned to excavate. He made the wrong call. Mrs. Hayes, he said, would it be fair to say that your history with the Hells Angels, your having saved the lives of 12 members 4 years ago, creates a sense of personal loyalty, an obligation to assist them when asked? Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, would it be fair to say that saving someone's life obligates you to them, or does it obligate them to you? Reese opened his mouth. Victoria continued before he could speak. Because I came here today because the medical evidence in this case was wrong. I would have come here to say that if Ethan Cole had no connection to anyone I had ever met, I would have come here if the defendant was a man I had never heard of, whose community I had no familiarity with, whose life had never intersected with mine in any way. Because what the evidence shows is what the evidence shows. And a young man is sitting at that table facing prison time for a version of events that his own body contradicts. She paused. My being in that warehouse 4 years ago is not why I'm here. The police report not matching the injuries is why I'm here. The courtroom was very quiet. Carl Reese stood at the podium and said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he said, no further questions, Your Honor. He walked back to his table and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided to stop digging. Again. Dennis Marsh did his redirect in 11 minutes. He walked Victoria through the chain of custody documentation one more time, slowly making sure every member of the jury understood not just what the records showed, but what the records implied. He asked her to describe in plain language what a Colles fracture was and how it occurred. He asked her to explain the difference between offensive and defensive injury patterns. He did it without drama, without performance, with the clean efficiency of someone who has been handed better material than he expected and is determined not to waste it. When he finished, he thanked her. She stepped down from the witness stand. She did not look at Reese. She did look briefly at Ethan. He was watching her with an expression that was beyond gratitude. It was the expression of someone who was watching something they had stopped believing was possible actually happen. She held his gaze for 1 second, gave him the smallest nod. Then she walked to the back of the courtroom. She sat down 3 rows behind the gallery railing across the aisle from where Marcus had been sitting. He was still there. He turned his head when she sat down. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But she was aware of him the way you are aware of someone who has been looking for you for a very long time, with a complicated mixture of acknowledgement and guardedness, the feeling of a door opening that you had not decided yet whether to walk through. The session continued. Judge Whitmore called the lunch recess at 12:43. The jury filed out. The attorneys gathered their papers. The gallery began to move toward the doors with the slightly dazed quality of an audience leaving a theater where the performance was better than they expected. Victoria didn't move immediately. She sat in her seat and she breathed and she let the tension of the morning move through her the way she always let tension move, not by releasing it suddenly, but by acknowledging it and giving it somewhere to go. She had learned this in trauma base. You couldn't afford to collapse after every difficult shift, but you couldn't pretend that difficult shifts weren't difficult. You had to find the middle place, the place where you carried the weight without being crushed by it. She was in that middle place now. Marcus walked over. He sat down next to her. Not close, he left a seat between them, a deliberate distance that she registered and appreciated. "You doing all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "That wasn't what I asked." She looked at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen from him since he walked in the doors of this morning. It was less guarded. Less the public face of someone managing the impression a room has of them. He looked in this moment like a person. "I'm tired," she said, because it was true and she had learned over years that the simplest, honest answer was always more efficient than the elaborated version. Or nodded. "That kind of tired where you're wired and exhausted at the same time." "Yes." "I know that tired," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Marcus said, "You know what Pullman is." It wasn't a question. Victoria looked at him. "I know what the evidence suggests," she said carefully. "Pullman has 3 businesses," Marcus said. 2 legitimate ones, significantly less so. Ethan saw something he wasn't supposed to see about 6 weeks before the incident on Creston Avenue. The assault on Creston wasn't random. It was a message. Victoria was quiet. "You can't say that in this courtroom." "I know. If you have evidence that the assault was premeditated, what we have isn't the kind of evidence courtrooms work with," Marcus said. "What we have is what people know, and the difference between what people know and what you can put in front of a judge is exactly the space Pullman has been living in for years." Victoria looked at the front of the empty courtroom, at the bench where Judge Whitmore had sat, at the witness stand she had just left, at the defendant's table where Ethan's pressed shirt lay slightly rumpled from a morning of sitting very still under enormous pressure. "The chain of custody irregularities," she said. "Do you know who accessed those records?" Marcus said nothing. "Marcus." He looked at her. "I know a name," he said, "but putting that name in front of you makes you a person who knows it, and I'm not willing to do that to you." Victoria turned to look at him directly. "I'm already a person who testified about the irregularities in open court. I'm already in the middle of this." "There's a middle and there's a deeper middle," Marcus said. "I'm trying to keep you in the outer one." She studied him. "You've been looking for me for 4 years to protect me." "I've been looking for you for 4 years because we owe you more than we've been able to pay," he said. "The protecting is extra." Something loosened in Victoria's chest, very slightly. She wasn't sure what to do with it. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "That's not how we see it." "It should be," she said. "What I did that night, I went in because people were in there. That's the whole reason. There's nothing to repay." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Can I tell you something?" "Go ahead." "Of the 12 men who came out of that warehouse," he said, 3 of them have kids now who wouldn't exist if that night ended differently. One of them finished school and started a business. One of them got out of the life, entirely moved to Oregon, teaches high school now. He sends me a text every year on the anniversary of that fire. Just a date and the word still. That's all, just still." Victoria was quiet. "You went in because people were in there," Marcus said. "I understand that, but the people who were in there went on to become the people I just described. And none of that is separate from what you did, whether you want the accounting or not." Victoria looked down at her hands. She thought about the night in question. The smoke, the heat, the voices on the radio disoriented, frightened. Some of them resigned in the way people get resigned when they believe the end has arrived. She thought about the way fear had lived in her body that night, very much present, very much real, and the way she had simply moved alongside it rather than letting it stop her. She had not thought much about what came after. She had not let herself. "There's a man named Cole," she said quietly. "That can't be a coincidence." "Ethan's uncle was one of the 12, Marcus said. Victoria went still. "Ethan doesn't know that's why Dennis was pointed in your direction," Marcus said. "His uncle asked me 3 months ago when the case started going wrong whether there was anything I could do. I couldn't put someone in that courtroom, but I could find you." The courthouse around them was nearly empty now. Voices echoed from somewhere down the hall. The particular institutional quiet of a building at lunchtime settled over the room. Victoria said Ethan's uncle, James Cole, he was the third man out of the building that night. You carried him most of the last hallway because his ankle was fractured. Victoria sat with this information. She had carried many people in many hallways. She remembered the ankle. She did not remember the face attached to it because she had been focused on the floor ahead and the door at the end of it. Does Ethan know? She asked. Not yet. When are you going to tell him? After this is over, Marcus said, when he has something to hear it with. Victoria looked at the courtroom again. She thought about the connection, the invisible thread that ran from a burning building 4 years ago to a pressed shirt at a defendant's table this morning. The way lives intersect in patterns that you can only see from a distance. She had come here because the evidence was wrong, and the reason the evidence was wrong connected back to a night she had spent 4 years not thinking about. What happens if it's not enough, she said. The testimony, the chain of custody. What if the jury? It'll be enough, Marcus said. She looked at him. How do you know? He said, because you told the truth clearly enough that 12 people couldn't miss it. And juries, whatever else they are people, and people recognize the truth when they hear it. They always have. Victoria was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I need to get some air. Marcus stood when she did. He didn't follow her. He simply stood, which was she was beginning to understand the way he moved through most situations, present, steady, not pushing. Victoria, he said. She turned. Whatever happens this afternoon, he said, you walked into this room today the same way you walked into that building 4 years ago. And I need you to know that it doesn't go unnoticed. Not by me. Not by anyone whose life is still here because of you. She held his gaze. She didn't have an answer for that, not a clean one, not the kind that wrapped things up neatly. She had spent 4 years being someone who didn't need to be found, and now she had been found, and the feeling of it was more complicated than she had words for. So she simply nodded, and she walked out into the hallway, where the air was a fraction cleaner, and the weight of the morning sat on her shoulders like something she would carry for a while longer before she could set it down. In the courtroom behind her, Ethan Cole's case was halfway through its hardest day. And in the records department of a hospital across town, a set of access logs that 2 people had believed would never matter were about to matter very much. The hallway outside courtroom 7 smelled like old coffee and floor wax, and Victoria stood in it with her back against the wall, and her eyes closed and did the thing she always did when the pressure of a room became too much to hold inside it. She counted her breaths, not because it was calming exactly, but because it was honest. Because the breath was the one thing in any situation she could always account for, and accounting for something real kept the rest of the noise from getting too loud. She got to 7 before her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, then something shifted in her, the same instinct that had turned her toward a burning building 4 years ago, when every sensible signal was pointing the other direction, and she picked up. Miss Hayes, the voice on the other end was male, older, careful in the way that people are careful when they are saying something they have rehearsed and are still not sure they should be saying. My name is Gerald Stein. I'm an administrator at St. Augustine Medical Center. Victoria went very still. St. Augustine was where Derek Pullman's emergency room records originated. Mr. Stein, she said, I've been watching the court proceedings, he said, on the public feed. All right, a pause, the kind of pause that has weight behind it. The access logs you described this morning, I know who ran them. Victoria pushed off the wall and walked to the far end of the hallway where the noise from the main corridor was a low murmur. Tell me. I need something first, Stein said. I'm a witness in a legal proceeding, she said. I can't make deals. I'm not asking for a deal. I'm asking for your word that what I'm about to tell you will go to the right people and not just disappear into a case file. I can't control what happens to information once it enters a legal proceeding. I know that, Stein said. I'm asking about your word, not the court's. Victoria stood in the hallway and understood that this man had made a decision that had cost him something to make, and that pushing him on process right now would lose her everything. You have my word, she said. Who accessed the records? Another pause, shorter this time. Dr. Raymond Cho, Stein said. He's on staff in our internal medicine department. He accessed the emergency records for Derek Pullman 6 days after admission. He has no clinical connection to Pullman's case. His specialty is entirely unrelated, and he wouldn't have any legitimate reason to review a trauma patient's ER documentation. Victoria said, and the second access, same login, Stein said. 2 days before the police report was finalized, he was in the system for 40 minutes. Victoria pressed her free hand flat against the wall. Do you have documentation of this? I have the raw server logs, Stein said. The system keeps them for 5 years. I printed them this morning. Why, she said. Why now? Why this morning? A long silence. Because I've known about those access events for 8 days, Stein said. I saw the irregularities when the defense filed their chain of custody challenge, and I checked the back-end logs. And I told myself it was a system error. I told myself it was administrative. I told myself a lot of things that I knew while I was telling them weren't true. His voice shifted thinner, more tired. And then I watched you sit in that witness stand this morning and tell a courtroom what the records showed. And you weren't afraid, and I have been afraid for 8 days over something I didn't even do. So, Victoria exhaled slowly. Mr. Stein, I need you to call Dennis Marsh. He is the defense attorney. His number is public record. Tell him exactly what you told me and tell him you have the server logs. He will know what to do with them. Will it be enough? Stein asked. It's the truth, Victoria said. That's usually enough given time. She heard him exhale on the other end. Then, thank you, Ms. Hayes. Thank you, Mr. Stein, she said. You made a hard call. She hung up. She stood in the hallway for 3 seconds. Then she walked back to the courtroom doors, pushed through them, and went straight to Dennis Marsh. Dennis went pale when she told him. Not dramatically, he was a professional, and professionals don't collapse where clients can see them, but the color shifted in his face in the particular way it does when someone receives information that is simultaneously exactly what they needed and significantly more than they were prepared for. Server logs, he said very quietly. Printed this morning. He's going to call you. Raymond Cho. Dennis repeated the name as if tasting it. I know that name. Victoria looked at him. From where? Pullman sits on the hospital's community advisory board, Dennis said. I saw the membership list when I was researching the case. He and Cho are both on it. He paused. They know each other. So Pullman had access to someone inside the hospital who could review and presumably alter the documentation before it became official court record. The modified version is what the police used for their report, Dennis said, which means the original version that says something different. Victoria finished. They looked at each other. If the server logs showed 2 access events by Cho and the original records differ from what ended up in the court file, Dennis said slowly, that's not administrative irregularity. That's evidence tampering. That's obstruction. That is an entirely different conversation. Yes, Victoria said. Pullman didn't just lie about what happened on Creston Avenue, Dennis said, working through it. He built infrastructure around the lie. He had help. He used a connection inside the hospital to modify the medical record that would have told the truth. Victoria said, get your phone out. Dennis got his phone out. It rang 20 seconds later. Gerald Stein's voice was audible from where Victoria stood. Not the words, but the tone, and the tone was steady in the particular way of a man who has committed to a course of action and is past the point of retreating from it. Dennis listened, and he took notes. He asked 2 precise questions and received 2 precise answers. When he hung up, he sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at Victoria. The server logs showed that the injury documentation was accessed in the document hash. The digital fingerprint of the file changed between the first access and the second. He modified it, Victoria said. Cho modified it, Dennis said. Or someone using Cho's login modified it, with Pullman's knowledge and almost certainly at Pullman's direction. He was already on his feet. I need to file an emergency motion before the afternoon session starts. I need to get these logs entered as evidence. I need to talk to the judge before Reese gets to him. He was moving. Victoria stepped aside. Then she said, Dennis. He stopped. Ethan, she said, he needs to know this is happening before the session starts. Not as a full explanation, just enough so he's not blindsided when it changes the shape of the afternoon. Dennis looked at her. He nodded once quickly. Then he turned and crossed the courtroom to where Ethan was sitting at the defendant's table with a paper coffee cup and the particular 1,000-yard stare of someone who has been living inside a very bad situation for long enough that they have forgotten what outside feels like. Victoria watched Dennis lean down and speak quietly to Ethan. She watched Ethan's face change. It didn't change in the way she expected. Not with relief, not with the release of tension. It changed with something harder and more complicated. His jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere private for a moment. Then he looked up and his gaze found Victoria across the room. She had seen that look before. In emergency rooms, in the aftermath of the very worst nights, in the faces of people who have just been told that the thing that happened to them was not an accident, that someone chose to do it, planned it, built systems around it. It was the look of someone whose suffering has just been given a specific author. And that was in some ways a harder thing to hold than uncertainty. Judge Whitmore came back from lunch 9 minutes before the scheduled resumption of the afternoon session, which told Victoria that Dennis had managed to reach him, and whatever Dennis had said had moved the judge's timeline. He called both attorneys to the bench immediately. Victoria sat in the gallery. Marcus was 2 rows behind her. He hadn't asked what was happening. He was watching the attorneys at the bench with the particular quality of attention of someone who has learned to read situations from the outside because they are rarely invited inside them. The conference at the bench lasted 6 minutes. Reese's posture changed during it. He had come back from lunch with the recovered confidence of someone who had regrouped over a sandwich and a phone call and reminded himself of all the reasons he was going to win this case. He had walked to the bench with his jacket buttoned and his expression calibrated and his tie perfectly straight. He walked away from the bench with his hand touching his tie and not letting go. Judge Whitmore addressed the courtroom. This court has been presented with an emergency motion by the defense to admit additional documentary evidence that was received by defense counsel within the last hour. Given the nature of the evidence and its direct bearing on the integrity of the existing court record, I am granting the motion. The defense will have the opportunity to present this evidence to the jury during the afternoon session. Mr. Reese, your objection is noted. Your Honor, Reese said, the prosecution has had no opportunity to Mr. Reese, the judge said. Your objection is noted. Reese sat down. Dennis Marsh, standing at his table, allowed himself exactly 1 second of something that might have been satisfaction. Then he opened his files and got back to work. Behind Victoria, Marcus leaned forward, very slightly. What just happened? He said, his voice barely above a murmur. Evidence came in, Victoria said. The real kind. She heard him exhale. The afternoon session moved fast. Dennis called Gerald Stein to testify by video conference. Stein was in his office at St. Augustine, composed and methodical, and he walked the jury through the server logs with the particular clarity of someone who understands that the most important thing he can do is make a technical subject legible to 12 people who did not come to court expecting to learn about hospital database systems. I explained what a document hash was. He explained why a changed hash meant a changed document. He explained the timeline of the 2 access events. He identified Dr. Raymond Cho's login credentials as the ones associated with both events. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate. He simply described what the records showed. It was devastating precisely because it was so calm. Carl Reese cross-examined Stein for 20 minutes. He raised the possibility of system errors. He questioned the chain of custody of the server logs themselves. He implied that Stein might have a personal motivation. He was thorough and professional, and he did everything a good lawyer does when the evidence is against him. None of it touched Stein's testimony, because Stein wasn't telling a story. He was reading a record, and the record said what it said regardless of how many ways you framed the question. When Stein's testimony ended, Dennis stood and said, Your Honor, the defense would like to call Dr. Raymond Cho. The room shifted. Reese was on his feet. Your Honor, Dr. Cho has not been listed as a witness by either party. He has now, Dennis said. We're calling him as a hostile witness under Rule 611. His presence is material to the integrity of the evidentiary record. Whitmore looked at Reese, then at Dennis, then at the door. Bailiff, he said, is Dr. Cho present in the building? Curtis checked his phone, looked up. He was served with a subpoena at 11:58 this morning, Your Honor. He's in the building. The room absorbed this information. Victoria looked at the door. She thought about timing, about the call from Stein, about the 40 minutes between when she answered that call and when the session resumed, about Dennis filing the emergency motion and serving the subpoena in the space of a lunch hour. She thought about what it meant to move quickly when the situation required it. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Sir Raymond Cho was 51 years old with the bearing of someone who has spent 2 decades being the most credentialed person in most rooms he entered. He wore a white dress shirt under a dark jacket. His face was arranged in an expression of calm that had clearly required effort to assemble and was holding together by will alone. He walked to the witness stand. He was sworn in. Dennis Marsh looked at him for a moment before speaking, just long enough for the silence to mean something. Then, Dr. Cho, are you familiar with Derek Pullman? We're acquainted, Cho said, through the hospital's community advisory board. Would you describe your relationship as a professional one? Yes, a personal one. We're acquainted. Dr. Cho, on the evening of, Dennis checked his notes and named a specific date. Did you access the emergency medical records of Derek Pullman through the St. Augustine Hospital database? A pause. I may have. I review a number of records in the course of a Dr. Cho. The server logs from St. Augustine's records management system show your login credentials accessing Derek Pullman's emergency documentation on that date, not a general review. A specific file open for 37 minutes. Did you access those records? Cho looked at Reese. Reese did not look back. I believe I may have reviewed them briefly, Cho said. 37 minutes is not brief, Dennis said. Why did you access Derek Pullman's emergency records? He was not your patient. His treatment was handled by the emergency department, which is outside your specialty. What clinical reason did you have to review his file? Cho stopped. Started again. I was asked to consult. By whom? A longer pause. By Mr. Pullman, Cho said. The courtroom went very still. Derek Pullman asked you to review his own emergency medical records, Dennis said. He asked me to look at them, yes. In your capacity as a physician? Yes. And during your review, did you make any changes to the documentation in that file? Cho's face changed. The assembled calm developed a crack small but visible to anyone watching closely. His eyes moved to the jury, then back to Dennis. There may have been some clarification of terminology. Dr. Cho, Dennis said, and his voice was quieter now, which made it more alarming, not less. The document hash recorded by the system before your access and the document hash recorded after your access do not match. That means the file content changed during your session. I'm asking you directly, did you alter the medical documentation of Derek Pullman's injuries? Cho said nothing. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Cho looked at the judge. Your Honor, I would like to consult with an attorney before answering further questions. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Dr. Cho, he said, you are currently under subpoena to testify in this proceeding. However, you do have the right to decline to answer questions that may incriminate you. I will note for the record that the invocation of that right in this context carries its own significance. He looked at the jury when he said it. The jury understood. Sir. The room erupted. Not physically, nobody stood up, nobody shouted, but there was a collective movement of sound and energy through the gallery that filled the high-ceilinged space, the way a wave fills a container. Victoria heard Marcus, behind her, make a sound, not a word, just a breath released with force. She heard Ethan say something to Dennis in a low, urgent voice that she couldn't make out from where she sat. She heard Carl Reese ask for a recess and Judge Whitmore deny it, with a brevity that communicated exactly how Whitmore was feeling about the shape of the afternoon. She felt the moment the way she felt the moments in trauma bays when the tide turns not with celebration, because there was still too much uncertainty, too much that could go wrong, too many ways for something true to be made smaller by process, but with the unmistakable physical sensation of weight beginning to shift. Dennis Marsh let the chaos settle for exactly as long as was professionally appropriate. Then he turned to the bench. Your Honor, in light of Dr. Cho's testimony and his invocation, the defense would like to formally request that this court consider whether the evidentiary record in this case has been compromised in a way that materially prejudices the defendant. Reese was on his feet. The prosecution objects to any characterization of the evidentiary record as compromised based on the testimony of a witness who has not fully answered the questions put to him. Mr. Reese, Whitmore said. The word landed like a period at the end of a sentence. Reese stopped. Whitmore looked at him. The prosecution's objection is recorded. The court will take a 30-minute recess to review the implications of this afternoon's testimony. Both counsel will meet with me in chambers. He stood. Everyone stood. Victoria watched Whitmore leave through the door behind the bench. She watched Reese follow, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who is managing the distance between a bad situation and a catastrophic one. She watched Dennis Marsh stop at the defendant's table on his way past and put one hand briefly on Ethan Cole's shoulder. Ethan looked up. Dennis said something she couldn't hear. Ethan nodded. Then Dennis was gone too, and Ethan sat alone at the defendant's table in a slightly rumpled pressed shirt, and the courtroom around him held its breath. Marcus leaned forward from 2 rows back. "Victoria," he said quietly. She turned. His face had none of its habitual guardedness. He looked like what he was, a man who had been carrying the weight of something unresolved for 4 years, watching that weight begin to lift. "The thing you said to Reese this morning," he said, "about being in rooms where the truth needed time and positioning to survive." "Yes. You've been doing this longer than nursing," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, and underneath it was a question he hadn't quite asked. Victoria looked at him. She thought about all the versions of her life that were true and how few people had ever been given more than one of them at a time. "My mother was a public defender," she said, "for 22 years. I watched her fight cases that couldn't be won through evidence alone because the evidence had been shaped before she got to it. I watched her lose some of them. I watched her find the ones she could win and find them the hard way." She paused. "I went into nursing because I wanted to be in the room before the evidence was written, so I could read the truth before anyone had a chance to edit it." Marcus looked at her for a long time. "Your mother," he said, "is she still practicing?" "She died 6 years ago," Victoria said. "I'm sorry." "She knew who she was," Victoria said. "That's a thing I've come to understand means a great deal." They sat in a courtroom that had just been turned inside out, and neither of them said anything for a while. Outside the chamber's door, something was happening that would determine the shape of the rest of this case. Inside the gallery, a few people had stayed: the journalist with the small notepad, 2 family members who had pressed close together, Curtis the bailiff standing quietly near the door. And at the defendant's table, Ethan Cole sat with his hands folded and waited for someone to tell him what came next. Victoria stood. She walked to the defendant's table. She pulled out the chair next to Ethan and sat down without asking permission, because the moment didn't call for permission. Ethan looked at her. "Your uncle," she said, "James Cole." Something moved across Ethan's face. "You know, Marcus told me during the lunch recess." Ethan looked down at his hands. His jaw worked. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights. "He never told me," Ethan said. "Uncle James. He never said who she was, who you were. He just, every year on a specific date in the fall, he gets real quiet for a while. And when I was old enough to ask, he said there was a night that changed what he thought was possible. That was all he said. He said a night that changed what he thought was possible." Victoria was quiet. "He didn't know it was you when Dennis contacted him," Ethan said. "He just knew that Pullman was trying to end my life over something I saw that I wasn't supposed to see, and he was willing to try anything. And Marcus found you, and none of us knew until today." "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever happens in that chambers meeting, and I think it's going to go the right way. I think the judge has seen enough that he cannot unsee you, should know that the truth of what happened on Creston Avenue was always going to come out. It might have taken longer without the testimony today. It might have taken a different route, but the body doesn't lie, and eventually someone reads it correctly." "You did," he said. "Your body did," she said. "I just read it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Why did you go into that building 4 years ago? My uncle's never been able to figure it out. He said you came from nowhere and you knew exactly what you were doing, and when it was over, you were gone. He said he's never understood it." Victoria thought about how to answer that. She thought about her mother, who had taken cases no one else would take because someone had to. She thought about the 11 years of trauma bays and the particular knowledge that accumulated in your body when you spent enough time in rooms where people were fighting to stay alive. She thought about the specific moment 4 years ago when she had heard the radio call and understood that the people who were supposed to go in were not going in, and that the choice was hers. "I was close," she said. "I had the training, and they were in there." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's what my uncle says," he said. "He says there's no better reason." Victoria looked at him. Then she said, "Your uncle is right." Right. The chamber's door opened. Dennis Marsh came back into the courtroom with the expression of a man who has just been told something he will not forget for the rest of his professional life. He walked to the defendant's table. He looked at Ethan. and he said Reese is withdrawing the charges. The silence that followed was the kind that fills every corner of a room, not empty but dense, charged with the weight of everything that was happening inside the people present. Ethan said, "What Reese has recommended to the court that the charges against you be dismissed," Dennis said. Given the questions raised about the integrity of the evidentiary record and the implications of Cho's invocation, he's made the call that proceeding is his word untenable. Meaning he doesn't want to be standing in the room when it gets worse, Marcus said from the gallery. He had stood at some point and was now at the railing. Dennis looked at him. "That's one reading." "That's the right reading," Marcus said. "Pullman is cutting losses. He figures Reese withdrawing now is cleaner than whatever comes out in the next 2 days. Whatever comes out in the next 2 days may come out in a different proceeding," Dennis said carefully. "But that's not today's matter." Ethan stood up. He stood up from the defendant's table for the first time all day without the weight of the charge pressing him down into the chair. He stood at his full height, which was not particularly remarkable, and he looked at Victoria, who was still sitting beside him. "This isn't over," said Pullman. "No," Victoria agreed, "it's not. But you're going home tonight," she said. "Not to a cell, not with a conviction on your record. You're going home, and that matters." Ethan looked at her. Something in him was working through a very complex calculation. Justice versus relief, the fact of what had been done to him versus the fact of what hadn't happened to him today. She watched him do the math. He sat back down. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, it does." Victoria looked at the empty bench, at the witness stand she had occupied that morning, at the door through which a judge was about to return to make this official. She thought about the moment this morning when she had walked in and Whitmore had looked at her jacket and made the fastest and most consequential mistake of the day. She thought about the way the room had felt, hostile, pre-decided, arranged against the woman in the worn leather jacket before she had spoken a word. She thought about the name inside the collar. Silver Angel. She had carried that name without ever choosing it, and it had carried her into this room today. And now a young man was going home instead of to a cell. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. The door behind the bench opened. Judge Richard Whitmore returned to his courtroom, and everyone rose in the machinery of justice, imperfect, slow, capable of being bent by powerful hands, but ultimately not entirely breakable, moved toward the moment that Ethan Cole had stopped allowing himself to imagine. And outside the courthouse, though none of them knew it yet, the riders were already gathering. Judge Richard Whitmore sat down. Everyone else sat down. And the courtroom, which had spent the entire day in various states of tension and revelation, settled into the particular quiet of a room that is about to hear something final. Whitmore looked at his notes. Then he looked up. He had the expression of a man who has spent 30 minutes in chambers doing something he does not often do, reconsidering. Not just the case. Himself, the way he had moved through this day. The specific moment this morning, when he had looked at a woman in a leather jacket and made a decision about her before she opened her mouth, and how much of this afternoon was the direct consequence of that decision being wrong. He did not announce all of that. Judges don't announce their private reckonings, but it was there in his face for anyone who had been watching him long enough to read it. "In the matter of State versus Ethan Cole," he said, "the court has received a recommendation from the prosecution that the charges against the defendant be dismissed. The court has reviewed this recommendation in light of the evidentiary developments of this afternoon and finds it appropriate. The charges against Ethan Cole are hereby dismissed with prejudice." With prejudice. Those two words meant they could not be refiled. That Pullman could not regroup, rebuild, wait 6 months and come back at Ethan from a different angle. It was over in the specific legal sense of a door being closed and locked. Ethan Cole sat at the defendant's table and did not move for a moment. Then Dennis Marsh put his hand on his shoulder and said something low, and Ethan exhaled one long, slow breath that looked like it had been held since the morning he was first arrested, and something in his posture changed entirely. Not dramatically. He didn't stand up and pump his fist. He didn't break down. He simply became a different kind of still, the still of a person who has set down something very heavy, rather than the still of a person bracing against it. Victoria watched from the gallery. She watched Ethan turn to Dennis and say something. She watched Dennis nod. She watched Ethan look at the door through which the jury had been dismissed at the bench, where Whitmore was already preparing to close the session at the table across from him, where Carl Reese was packing his files with the precise, controlled movements of a man who is managing a significant professional humiliation. Then Ethan turned and looked at Victoria. I didn't say anything. He simply looked at her the way people look when words are not the right tool for what they need to communicate. She gave him back a small nod, the same one she had given him from the witness stand that morning, but different now because everything was different now. He nodded back. Then the session was closed, the gallery began to empty, and the day that had started with a judge telling a woman her jacket didn't belong began to become the past. Whitmore did not leave immediately. That was the first thing Victoria noticed. The attorneys had gone, the bailiffs were resetting the room, and the judge was still at his bench. He had taken off his reading glasses and was sitting with them in his hand, looking at the middle distance, with the expression of a man engaged in a conversation entirely inside his own head. Victoria had retrieved her jacket from the chair where she had placed it during her testimony. She was pulling it on when she heard footsteps and looked up to find Whitmore standing at the railing. He was not in his robe. He had taken it off, he was in his dress shirt and slacks, and without the robe he looked smaller somehow, more ordinary, more like a person who had made a mistake and was aware of it. "Ms. Hayes," he said. She looked at him. Tone had the bearing of a man who gives apologies rarely and has therefore not developed a smooth way to do it. He looked uncomfortable. He looked, she thought, honest. "I want to say something to you," he said, "not for the record, just as a person." She waited. "This morning," he said, "the jacket, I made a judgment before I had any information to base it on. And then I spent the rest of the morning defending that judgment in small ways, the way people do when they don't want to admit they were wrong from the start." He paused. "I've been on this bench for 16 years. I know what the law requires. I know what fairness requires. And today I let neither of those things be my first instinct." Victoria looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to hear it said plainly," Whitmore said, "not in procedural language, not wrapped in legal qualification. Just you walked in here today as a witness, and I treated you as a problem. That was wrong, and the fact that the day ended correctly is not a reason to leave that unacknowledged." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Your Honor," she said. "I appreciate that. I want to say something back, also not for the record." "Go ahead." "Ethan Cole has been living under this charge for 8 months, she said. 8 months of his life in which he was the person who attacked someone according to the official record. His employment options, his housing, his relationships, everything has been shaped by that label for 8 months. The fact that it ends today correctly doesn't erase those 8 months." Whitmore held her gaze. "No," he said, "it doesn't." "So the answer to the right instinct being late," she said, "isn't just an apology to me. It's whatever you decide to do with what you saw today going forward." He stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "That's fair." I know," Victoria said. She pulled her jacket closed. Whitmore looked at it, the worn leather, the silver zipper pull, the years it carried. He looked at it differently than he had this morning. She could see it in his eyes. The coat was the same coat. The woman was the same woman. The thing that had changed was what he was willing to see. "The name," he said, "inside the collar." "Yes." "The president of the Hells Angels knew it." "Yes." "Are you going to tell me the story behind it?" Victoria looked at him. "No," she said, "but someone will eventually. These things get around." She walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was different now. It held the particular energy of late afternoon in a courthouse, the charged business of the day winding down, a few lawyers moving with the purposeful tiredness of people finishing their last tasks before they could stop. The journalist was near the exit, talking rapidly into his phone. 2 of the jurors were speaking quietly near the elevator, glancing back toward the courtroom, with the expression of people processing something that exceeded their expectations for the day. Marcus was leaning against the wall outside the courtroom door. He had Ethan beside him, and beside Ethan was a man Victoria did not immediately recognize. Early 50s, stocky with a slightly uneven gait, and eyes that found her the moment she came through the door and did not look away. She stopped. The man took a step toward her, and something in the way he moved, careful, deliberate, the slight favoring of his left side reached into her memory and found something she had kept there without knowing it. The last hallway, the smoke, the weight of a man who was fighting to stay upright and not quite managing it, and the specific physical reality of putting her shoulder under his arm and taking some of that weight for the last 40 feet to the exit. "James Cole," she said. His voice when he spoke was rougher than she expected and steadier than she thought anyone in his position could be. "You have no idea," he said, "how long I've been trying to figure out how to say what I want to say to you." Victoria looked at him. She said, "You don't need to say anything." "Yes, I do," James said, "because I've been carrying this for 4 years and the carrying is done now." He stopped 2 feet in front of her. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying exactly, but from the specific physical effort of not crying in a hallway where he did not want to break down. "I didn't know your name," he said. "I didn't know your face. I heard your voice in the smoke and I followed it because it was the only thing that was calm in a situation where everything else was coming apart. You kept saying, 'This way, just this way, keep moving.' And I kept moving because your voice made it seem possible that there was a direction worth moving in." Victoria was quiet. "I have a daughter," James said. "She was 2 years old that night. She's 6 now. Her name is Rose." He stopped, started again. "She doesn't know about that night. She's too young. But she will. And when she's old enough to hear it, I'm going to tell her that the reason her father came home is because a woman walked into a burning building for someone she'd never met. And she did it because that's who she is." Victoria felt something move through her chest. Warm complicated the particular feeling of being truly seen by someone who has no reason to do anything but be honest. She said, "She sounds like she's going to be worth knowing." James laughed. It came out slightly broken, the laugh of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and just released it. "She's going to take over the world," he said. "She already has opinions about everything." "She sounds like her uncle," Marcus said from behind him. Ethan made a sound that was half laugh and half something else. James looked at Victoria for another long moment. Then he held out his hand. She took it. He shook it once, firmly, and then he held on for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and she let him, because she understood that the extra moment was not about her. It was about him finishing something he had needed to finish for 4 years. When he let go, he stepped back. He straightened. He looked, she thought, lighter. "Thank you," he said. "Take care of your nephew," she said. James looked at Ethan, who was watching the two of them with the expression of someone who has just been given a piece of his own history he didn't have before. "Always have," James said. "Always will." They moved toward the building exit, all of them together in the loose formation of people who have been through something difficult in proximity and are not quite ready to separate back into their individual lives. Ethan walked between his uncle and Marcus. He was quiet in a way that was different from the silence quiet of the courtroom. It was a thinking quiet, a processing quiet, the quality of someone who is taking inventory of what they have and what has changed. Dennis Marsh fell into step beside Victoria. "For what it's worth," he said, "I have been practicing law for 17 years, and today is the most extraordinary single day I have had in a courtroom." Victoria looked at him. "Is that good or bad?" "Profoundly good," Dennis said, "and mildly terrifying." She almost smiled. "That's about right." "The Cho matter," Dennis said, lowering his voice. "The falsified records. That doesn't end with today." "No," she agreed. "The district attorney's office is going to get involved. The hospital is going to conduct an internal review. Pullman's exposure goes significantly beyond what happened on Creston Avenue." "I know." "You're going to be asked to testify again," Dennis said, "in whatever proceeding comes next." Victoria walked. "I know that too. And I'll be there," she said. "Same as today." Dennis looked at her sideways. "You're not what I expected when Marcus described you." "What did Marcus describe?" "Someone who was very hard to find and very good at what she did," Dennis said. "He didn't tell me the rest of it." "The rest of what?" Dennis was quiet for a moment. "That you understand how rooms work, not just medical rooms, all of them, the politics of them, the power structures, the way information moves and gets shaped. You knew about the chain of custody irregularities 3 weeks ago, and you waited until you were under oath in front of a jury to say it. That's not nursing training." "My mother was a public defender for 22 years, Victoria said. "She taught you this." "She showed me what it looked like," Victoria said. "That's different." They reached the main doors. Marcus pushed through first and held the door, and Victoria stepped outside into the late afternoon and stopped. The street in front of the courthouse held something she had not expected. Not because she hadn't been told, Marcus had mentioned 2 hours ago that people were gathering, but being told something and being in front of it were different things. There were motorcycles along the curb in both directions. She couldn't count them easily. They were parked in staggered rows and the riders stood or leaned beside them with the particular unhurried quality of people who have come somewhere to be present and are not in a hurry to stop being present. Some of them she could see were older. Some of them she could see were young. They came in the full range of human faces and sizes, and the only thing uniform about them was the way they were standing, waiting not aggressively, not performatively, but with the particular intentionality of people who have decided that this moment required their physical presence and have provided it. When she stepped through the door, the sound that moved through them was not a shout. It was not a cheer. It was something lower and more resonant, a collective acknowledgement, like an exhale, like the sound a room makes when something that has been held too long is finally released. Victoria stood on the courthouse steps and looked at them. One of them, a large man with gray in his beard, who she would later learn had been one of the 12 in the warehouse, simply raised one hand. Not dramatically, not as a salute, just raised it. The way you raise a hand to someone across a room when words are the wrong distance. Others did the same. It moved through them in a wave. Victoria's throat tightened. She recognized the feeling and let it be there without pushing it down. She had learned over years that some moments were entitled to exactly the amount they asked for, and this was one of them. Marcus came to stand beside her. "You said you didn't want any of this," he said. "I didn't. Do you want it now?" She looked at the row of raised hands, at the faces that belonged to lives that had continued, at the gray-bearded man who was now lowering his hands slowly with the careful dignity of someone completing a ceremony. "One isn't the right word," she said. "What's the right word?" She thought about it. "Receive," she said finally. "I think I can receive it." Marcus was quiet, then good. Ethan came through the door behind them with James at his side. When Ethan saw the street, the rows of bikes, the riders, the collective presence assembled in the late afternoon, he stopped. He looked at it. He looked at Marcus. "For me," he said. "For both of you," Marcus said, "but don't let it go to your head." The gray-bearded man walked up from the street. He was enormous, broad through the chest and shoulders, moving with the deliberateness of a large man who has learned to occupy his size without letting it become threatening. He walked up to Victoria and stopped. "My name is Roy Baines," he said. "You probably don't remember me specifically." "I remember a voice in the smoke," she said, "telling someone named Deacon to stay low." Roy Baines blinked. "That's me." His voice went rough for a moment. He cleared it. "That's me exactly." She looked at him. "I want to ask you something," Roy said. "Go ahead." "All these years," he said, "you never reached out, never sent word that you were okay, that you'd gotten out safe. We didn't know if you'd made it. For almost 2 months we didn't know." He paused. "Why?" Victoria had not been asked this question directly before. She had thought about it, the version she would give if asked, but thinking about an answer and speaking it were different. "Because I was afraid," she said. Roy looked at her. He had not expected that. "Afraid of what?" Marcus said from beside her. She took a moment. "Afraid that if I was connected to it, to the fire, to the rescue, to all of it, it would become the central thing about me. And I didn't want to be the woman who walked into a burning building. I wanted to be the woman who showed up for whoever needed her next." She paused. "Because the fire was one night. The next person who needed help was going to be tomorrow. And I didn't want to be standing in the middle of a story about 4 years ago when someone needed me in the present." The people close enough to hear were quiet. Roy Baines looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "The woman who walked into the building so she could get out and walk into the next one." "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "My wife said something like that once," he said, "about the best kind of people. She said they don't stop to take credit because stopping costs time they don't want to spend when there's more work to do." Victoria looked at him. "She sounds right." "She usually is," Roy said. "She's going to want to meet you." Victoria said, "That would be all right." James Cole moved through the crowd with Ethan, and Victoria watched them, the uncle and nephew, the man whose fractured ankle she had carried the last 40 feet, and the young man who had been about to have his life taken from him by a lie, moving among people who knew their names and were glad to see them there. She watched Ethan receive the kind of presence that community provides when it shows up without being asked to. She watched him struggle with it slightly, the particular discomfort of a young man who has been taught to manage his own weight and is being offered help from every direction. She watched him learn in real time that accepting this was not weakness. Marcus moved back to stand beside him. He's going to be all right, Victoria said. Yes, Marcus agreed. He is. What happens with Pullman? She said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The DA's office got a call this afternoon. Before the session ended, someone I trust tells me there's already an investigator assigned. Cho will talk, Victoria said. When faced with his own criminal exposure, he'll talk. That's what I think too, Marcus said. And Pullman? Marcus looked at her. Men like Pullman count on the gap between what people know and what can be proved. Today you close that gap considerably. He paused. It won't happen tomorrow. These things take time and patience, and a willingness to stay in the fight through the slow parts. I know, she said. Are you willing? She looked at him. I told Dennis I'd be there for whatever comes next. I heard, Marcus said. I'm asking something different. She waited. Are you willing to stop disappearing it, he said. After tonight, after this crowd goes home and the day becomes a story people tell, are you willing to let people know where you are? Victoria was quiet. The question landed differently than she expected. Not as an imposition, not as a demand or a recruitment pitch. It landed as something simpler and therefore more significant. It landed as, are you willing to be findable? Are you willing to let the people whose lives you have intersected know that you are still in the world? She thought about the 9 years of the jacket, the $40 purchase, and the woman outside the diner in West Texas who had thrown in a cup of coffee and looked at her like she already knew where the jacket was going. She thought about the name inside the collar, given not chosen belonging to her. Anyway, in the specific way things belong to you when they have been witnessed. She thought about her mother working late in a small office on cases that couldn't be won through evidence alone, and what it meant to love justice without sentimentality. She thought about Rose Cole, who was 6 years old and had opinions about everything and didn't know yet that her father came home from a burning building because a woman decided that direction was still worth moving in. I'm willing to stop disappearing, she said. Marcus nodded. He said nothing more because nothing more was needed. The late afternoon shifted toward evening, and the crowd did not rush. People spoke with each other. Some of them found Victoria and introduced themselves with the particular directness of people who are not interested in being indirect about the fact that they have something they want to say. She listened to all of them. She did not perform humility. She was not the performing type, but she received what they brought with the same full attention she brought to every difficult situation. Because these were people, and people in her experience were always worth the full attention. At some point, Dennis Marsh appeared at her elbow with 2 paper cups of coffee from the truck at the corner. He handed her one without ceremony. She took it. The journalist from inside, Dennis said. He wants a statement. Tell him I don't have one. He'll write the story anyway. I know, she said. The story is going to be what the story is. I'd rather not put words in it that I'll spend time regretting. Dennis drank his coffee. He's going to write about the jacket. He saw it. He's going to write that the judge tried to make you take it off. He was in the room, she said. He's allowed to write what he saw. Dennis looked at her. You're not concerned about how it makes Whitmore look. Whitmore made a mistake, Victoria said. He knows he made a mistake. He said so directly and without qualification. What a journalist writes about that is between the journalist and his editor. Dennis was quiet for a moment. You have a very particular way of operating. I just don't spend energy on things I can't control, she said. I tried it once. It was exhausting and it didn't work. From somewhere in the crowd, James Cole's laugh carried across the noise louder this time. Freer the laugh of a man who has been released from something rather than managing it. Ethan's voice joined it, lighter than she had heard it all day. Young, she thought. He was so young, and he had carried something that weighed far too much for far too long, and now he was laughing in the early evening with his uncle and a crowd of people who had shown up for him. She thought about what Marcus had said earlier, the men who walked out of the warehouse and went on to have kids and start businesses and send a text every year on the anniversary of the fire. Just a date and the word still. She thought about how many of those still moments had accumulated in the 4 years she had spent carefully not being findable, and what it meant that all of them had happened because one night she had known the right direction. Not because she was extraordinary, because she was close, and she had the training, and people were in there. That had always been the whole truth of it. Roy Baines found her again near the end of the evening. He was carrying his helmet under one arm. He looked more relaxed now. The ceremony of the afternoon had become the ordinary human ease of people gathered around a shared experience. And he wore it the way people wear the relief of something resolved. "You going to be all right tonight?" he said. Victoria looked at him. "I'm going to go home and eat something and sleep for 10 hours. "Good plan," he said. "The medical evidence you testified about today. You said Pullman's injuries were defensive." "Yes." Ethan fight back. "The evidence says he deflected effectively and returned force while being attacked," she said. "Yes." Roy nodded slowly. "Kid's tougher than he looks." "Most people are," Victoria said. Roy laughed, brief, genuine. Then, "My wife's name is Helen," he said. "I'm serious about wanting her to meet you. She'd never forgive me if I let this moment pass without arranging it." "Tell her I'm not hard to find anymore," Victoria said. Roy looked at her. He understood what that meant, not just socially, but in the larger sense. He nodded with the quiet gravity of someone who has just been told something important. "I'll tell her," he said. He moved back toward his bike. Marcus appeared. He had the contained energy of someone who has been managing a large and complex situation all day and is allowing himself to stop managing it only gradually in small increments, the way you release pressure from something that has been held under it for a long time. "I owe you something," he said. Victoria looked at him. "No, you don't." "I'm saying it anyway." He stopped, seemed to work through the exact words he wanted. "When my people came out above that building and told me about a woman's voice calm, in the middle of all of that, just calm, I told them whoever she is, she's the kind of person the world doesn't make enough of." He looked at her directly. "I've spent 4 years looking for you because I believed that, and I needed you to know it was believed, not because it obligates you to anything, not because it comes with conditions, just it was true, and you deserve to hear it said." Victoria looked at him. She said, "When your text comes every year on that date." Marcus looked at her. "What about it?" "Send it to me too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I will." She walked to the edge of the gathered crowd. She stood there and looked back at it, at Ethan and James and Dennis and Roy and Marcus and the rest of them, the people connected to each other by a fire that had nearly ended differently by a day in a courtroom, that had nearly gone wrong by the simple and complicated fact that some nights someone decides the right direction is still worth moving toward. The weight she had been carrying since she walked into the building that morning was still there. But it was different weight now, not the weight of something pressing down, the weight of something solid underfoot, the kind you could stand on. She pulled the jacket close, and inside the collar in faded silver thread, the name she had never chosen but had carried anyway, held its position. Still, Part 5, the fire that names you. She slept for 9 hours. Not 10 the way she had told Roy Baines she would. 9, because at 6:47 in the morning, her phone started and didn't stop. And by the time she silenced the fourth call and looked at the screen, she understood that something had happened overnight that she was not going to be able to sleep through. The journalist had published his story. She lay in bed and read it on her phone with the particular stillnesses of someone reading about themselves for the first time, not narcissistically, not with vanity, but with the careful attention of a person checking whether the record of a thing bears any resemblance to the experience of living it. The headline was, "Nurse in Biker Jacket Dismantles Falsified Evidence, Forces Dismissal of Assault Charges." The first paragraph described a courtroom in which a judge told a woman to remove her jacket. The second paragraph described the woman declining. The third paragraph described what happened for the next 6 hours. It was accurate. That was the first thing she noticed. He had not dramatized what didn't need dramatizing. The facts were dramatic enough on their own, and he had understood that. He had not named her road name in the headline, but he had included it in the body of the piece, in a paragraph that described Marcus walking through the doors and saying 2 words that changed the shape of the room. She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a while. Her mother would have read this piece and then poured a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and said something specific and useful about it. That was the way her mother operated. She processed things through language, through the act of naming them, precisely because she believed that imprecise language was how important things got lost. Victoria was more like her father in this way. Her father, who had been an ER physician and who had taught her without meaning to, that the most useful response to any significant event was to get a full night's sleep and then ask what needed to happen next. She sat up. She got dressed, she made coffee, and then her phone rang again, and this time the number was Dennis Marsh, and she answered it. "Have you seen it?" he said. "Yes." "The DA's office called me this morning at 7:15, Dennis said. "They want to speak with you, today." Victoria drank her coffee. "About the chain of custody evidence. About all of it. The chain of custody, your testimony, what you know about Pullman's connection to Cho. They're moving fast." "Because the story is out," she said. "Because the story is out," Dennis confirmed. "These things don't happen in a vacuum. Public attention changes the timeline. When do they want to meet?" 10 o'clock. She looked at the time. It was 7:52. "I'll be there." "Victoria," Dennis paused. "This is the part where it gets harder before it gets easier. You know that." "I know." "Pullman has lawyers," he said. "Good ones. Expensive ones. They're going to look at everything you've ever done, every case you've ever been adjacent to, every professional decision you've made in 11 years. They're going to look for something to use." "Let them look," she said. "You're not worried." "I'm appropriately worried," she said. "I'm just not going to let the appropriate worry change what I do." Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your mother was a public defender." "Yes." "She ever worry every day," Victoria said. "She just didn't let it become the reason." She heard Dennis exhale on the other end, the particular exhale of someone who has received an answer that made them feel better about the road ahead. 10 o'clock, he said. "I'll meet you there." The district attorney's office occupied 4 floors of a building 3 blocks from the courthouse, and it had none of the theatrical weight of a courtroom. It was functional, slightly too warm, with the institutional carpet pattern of an office that prioritized durability over aesthetics. The woman who met Victoria in the lobby was 48 years old, dark-haired, and moved through the building with the efficiency of someone who had been navigating this specific space for a long time. Her name was Patricia Kellner. She was the chief deputy district attorney, and she had been on the Pullman situation since the previous afternoon. She shook Victoria's hand with the directness of someone who does not have time for a preamble and also genuinely does not prefer it. "Ms. Hayes," she said, "I've read your testimony twice. I've read Stein's. I've reviewed the server logs. I want to talk to you about what you know, what you observed, and what you're prepared to say under oath in a criminal proceeding that will be significantly more adversarial than what you experienced yesterday." "All right," Victoria said. "Are you prepared for that?" "Yes." Kellner looked at her for a moment. Not assessing she had already done the assessment, Victoria could tell before she walked into the lobby. She was confirming something she had already concluded. "Good," Kellner said. "Come with me." The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Victoria described everything: the chain of custody irregularities, the document, hash discrepancy, the timeline of access events, the specific clinical inconsistencies she had identified between Pullman's stated account and his injury pattern. She described the conversation with Stein. She described what Marcus had told her about Pullman's business activities and the nature of what Ethan had witnessed. She described it all without editorializing, without speculation, beyond what the evidence directly supported, with the same clinical clarity she had brought to the witness stand. Kellner listened with the focused attention of someone who is simultaneously processing information and building a structure from it. She asked precise questions when she needed clarification and did not ask questions when she didn't. Dennis sat beside Victoria and said very little. He was there as her attorney for the purpose of this meeting, a role he had offered and she had accepted, and he was doing the job of that role with the same efficiency he had brought to everything else in the last 24 hours. At the 2-hour mark, Kellner set down her pen. "Cho," she said, "you believe he'll cooperate." "When he understands the full scope of his exposure," Victoria said. "Yes, he's not a man who built his career around risk. He made one very large mistake for someone he trusted, and he's going to want to put as much distance between himself and that mistake as quickly as possible." "That's consistent with what we're seeing," Kellner said. "His attorney contacted my office this morning at 8:30. Victoria said nothing. "He's cooperating," Kellner said. "Fully." Dennis looked up from his notepad. "He's confirmed that Pullman approached him 7 weeks after the incident on Creston Avenue," Kellner said. "Pullman told him the medical records created a problem. He described what he needed changed. He indicated Cho's word is implied that it would be worth Cho's while financially, and that Pullman had the ability to make professional difficulties for Cho if he declined. Victoria said he coerced him. Cho's characterization is that he felt he had no choice, Kellner said. The facts will be presented to a jury, and they'll determine how much weight to give that characterization. But the core of his statement that Pullman directed the modification of the records is documented. And with the server logs as corroboration, we have a foundation. What's the charge? Dennis asked. Obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, suborning perjury, and extortion, Kellner said. The Creston incident itself, the assault on Ethan Cole, generates its own charge structure given the context of what Cole had witnessed. Witness intimidation, Victoria said. Among others, Kellner said. She looked at Victoria directly. You are going to be the foundation witness in this case. Everything that made yesterday possible is what this prosecution will be built on. I need to know you understand what that means in practical terms. It means the next year is difficult, Victoria said. At minimum, Kellner said, it means Pullman's attorneys will challenge everything. It means your professional record will be examined. It means your personal history will be examined. It means the night of the warehouse fire, which I've now read about in this morning's article, and which I imagine you did not expect to become publicly relevant, will be relevant. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I understand that, she said. Are you prepared for it? She thought about the question. Not about the answer, she knew the answer, but about what the question actually cost to ask, because Kellner was not asking out of doubt. She was asking because she needed to know this witness was solid, and that meant knowing the witness had looked at the hard parts clearly and chosen to stand in them anyway. I've been in rooms where the truth needed protecting, Victoria said. Yesterday was one of them. Whatever comes next is another. The form changes. The work doesn't. Kellner held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. We'll be in touch about next steps, likely within the week. She stood. Victoria stood. They shook hands again. And when Victoria walked out of that building and into the morning, something had shifted in the way the day felt against her, not lighter exactly, more purposeful. The difference between weight you are carrying and weight you are using. She called Marcus from the sidewalk. He picked up on the second ring. How'd it go? Cho is cooperating, she said, a pause. Since when? His attorney called Kellner this morning at 8:30. Another pause longer. She could hear him processing it. So Pullman already knows. He knows Cho flipped, she said. Yes. His lawyers will be moving to control the narrative, Marcus said. Settlement offers media statements, character witnesses. He'll try to build a wall between himself and the criminal exposure. Kellner seems prepared for that. She's good, Marcus said. I know her reputation. She's very good. Marcus, Victoria said. Ethan needs to know about Cho before it's in the news. I'll call him right now. And James, she said. James deserves to know what his nephew's testimony was connected to. The full thing. I know, Marcus said. I've been thinking about how to do that conversation. Directly, she said. James is the kind of man who wants things said plainly. Yeah, Marcus said. He is. A pause. How are you doing, not the case? You. Victoria stood on the sidewalk with the morning moving around her. Traffic, people with coffee cups, the ordinary forward motion of a city going about its business in complete indifference to the fact that something had been decided in a courtroom yesterday that was going to change the shape of several lives. I'm all right, she said. Honest answer. She thought about it. I'm tired. I'm clear. I'm not sorry I did any of it. That's a good place to be. Marcus, she said. Yeah. That text you sent on the anniversary, she said. Just the date and the word still. Yes. Who do you send it to? A long pause. All 12, he said. And I get 12 back. Victoria stood with that for a moment. 12 men once a year on a specific date, confirming to each other that they are still in the world. A ritual that had been running for 4 years. A thread that connected 12 lives to a single night and to each other. 13 now, she said. She heard him go quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Deeper. 13, he said. Okay. The week that followed moved fast and slow at the same time, fast in the practical sense, because the Pullman investigation was moving with the momentum that public attention and a cooperating witness create, and slow in the personal sense, because Victoria was also living her regular life, working her regular shifts, handling the regular emergencies that arrived in the trauma unit at unpredictable hours with no regard for what else was happening in her existence. She testified before a grand jury on Thursday. She described the same evidence she had described in the courtroom with the same clarity to a group of people who had not been in the room for the original proceeding and who needed to understand why what she was saying mattered. She took her time with them. She used the same plain language. She answered the questions asked and did not volunteer beyond what was asked. Because she had learned from watching her mother for 22 years that grand jury proceedings reward precision and punish performance. When she finished and walked out of the room, Dennis was in the hallway. "Good," he said. "They understood," she said. "That's all that matters." On Friday, Pullman's attorney issued a statement to the press describing the investigation as politically motivated and his client as a victim of orchestrated character assassination. Victoria read it once and put her phone down and went back to work. On Saturday morning, she drove to James Cole's house. She had not called ahead. She brought coffee from the corner place near her apartment, the kind worth driving across town with, and she knocked on the door. James answered it in a sweatshirt and the expression of a man who was surprised in the particular way of someone who has not quite allowed themselves to believe that the good things from the previous week were real and permanent. "Victoria," he said. "I brought coffee," she said. "Can I come in?" He opened the door wider. The house was modest and lived in, with the quality of a space that has been organized by someone who cares but does not perform caring. There were photos on the wall near the entrance, family pictures, the unself-conscious, and in one of them, Victoria saw a small girl with an enormous grin and a gap where a front tooth had recently been, who she knew without being told was Rose. James poured the coffee into actual mugs without asking whether she wanted a mug, and she appreciated that about him. They sat at the kitchen table. "Cho flipped," he said, "you heard. Marcus called me Wednesday." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "Means it's going forward, the real case." "Yes." "Means Ethan testifies." "Likely," she said. "What he witnessed, what he saw, that made Pullman decide he was a problem that's going to be central. Dennis is already preparing him." James was quiet for a moment. 8 months, he said. "My nephew spent 8 months with that charge hanging over him. 8 months of people looking at him like he was the kind of person who attacks someone without cause." "I know. He's a good kid," James said. "People don't always, you see the way he presents, the way he carries himself, you make assumptions. But he's a good kid." "I know he is," Victoria said. "I sat next to him in that courtroom for 3 hours. I watched how he handled it. He's steady under pressure. That's not common." James looked at her. "He gets it from his mother, my sister. He stopped. "She called me Thursday when she heard about Cho. First thing she said was, 'Is Victoria Hayes all right? Not Ethan, not Pullman, you.'" Victoria was quiet. "She wanted me to tell you thank you," James said. She has trouble with the phone since a health thing a few years back, but she wanted me to tell you directly." "Tell her I'm all right," Victoria said, "and tell her Ethan handled himself well. She raised someone steady." James nodded. He looked down at his coffee, then back up. "The fire," he said. She waited. "I've thought about it almost every day for 4 years," he said. "Not with fear, just it was the most real I have ever felt. Not during the fire. During the fire, I was terrified. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't. But after walking out of that building and realizing I was walking out of it, there's a clarity in that moment that I've never found anywhere else." "I know that feeling," Victoria said. "You do," he said. "Not a question, recognition. Every time the trauma bay goes a certain way," she said. "When something that looked impossible goes right. There's a second at the end where everything is very clear and very simple." "Yes," James said. "That's it, exactly." He looked at her. "I want to ask you something. You can tell me, it's none of my business." "Ask." "The night of the fire," he said, "were you scared?" Victoria looked at him. She thought about honest versus true, the difference between the answer that was factually accurate and the answer that told the truth. "I was terrified," she said. "I was so scared my hands were shaking. I kept them moving so nobody would see." James stared at her. "The calm voice," he said, "the absolute calm voice on the radio. Was terrified on the inside," she said. That's the thing I want you to understand, because I think you might have built a version of that night in your head where I was fearless, and I wasn't. I was afraid, and I went anyway. And the going anyway is the only part that matters. James Cole sat at his kitchen table with his coffee growing cold in his hands and looked at the woman across from him. He said, "My daughter is going to hear this story." "Good," Victoria said. "The real version," he said, "the terrified and went anyway version." "That's the only version worth telling us," she said. They sat in the kitchen for another hour. They talked about Rose and about James's work and about the neighborhood and about the small, ordinary things that make up the texture of a life. They did not perform anything for each other. They were simply two people who had been connected by one terrible night and had arrived on the other side of it and were now having coffee on a Saturday morning. When Victoria stood to leave, James walked her to the door. He said, "Same time next month." She looked at him. Saturday morning coffee. "If you're willing." She thought about what Marcus had asked her, "Are you willing to stop disappearing?" She thought about what she had said in return. "I'm willing," she said. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that looked like no particular kind of morning, Derek Pullman was indicted on 6 counts: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, extortion, witness intimidation, conspiracy to commit fraud, and 1 count she had not expected and that Kellner had not mentioned in their first meeting: racketeering tied to the business activities that Ethan had witnessed and that the investigation had fully excavated in the weeks since Cho began cooperating. Dennis called her when the indictment was announced. His voice had the controlled quality of someone who is very pleased and is allowing himself to be very pleased in a measured way. 6 counts, he said. "I heard." "Racketeering surprised me," he said. "It shouldn't have," she said. "Kellner is thorough." "Pullman's attorney is already talking about challenging the admissibility of the server logs," Dennis said. "They'll lose that challenge," Victoria said. "The chain of custody on those logs is clean. Stein documented everything correctly from the moment he pulled them." "I know," Dennis said, "but it means more proceedings, more testimony." "I know that too," she said. "You're still in Denon," she said. "When have I suggested otherwise?" A pause. Then, with the slightly surprised quality of a man who has been given consistently more than he expected, "Never." "Let Kellner know I'm available whenever she needs me," Victoria said. "And tell Ethan to call me if he needs to talk before his testimony. Not about the legal strategy, that's your territory, just to talk." "I'll tell him," Dennis said. She hung up. She sat in the break room of the trauma unit with 15 minutes left before her shift resumed, and she thought about what the next several months would look like. The hearings, the testimony, the slow grinding process of a criminal prosecution moving through its stages. She thought about Pullman's lawyers and what they would find and what they would try to do with what they found. She thought about the ways cases like this could go sideways, the witnesses who recanted, the evidence that got challenged on technicalities, the juries that convicted on some counts and acquitted on others. She thought about her mother, who had stood in difficult rooms for 22 years with the knowledge that winning was not guaranteed, and who had stood there anyway. She thought about the text she would receive in the fall. Just a date and a word. A word. Still, wow. The text came on a Friday evening in October, 47 days after the indictment. It came from a number she had saved as Marcus. It contained the date of the warehouse fire and the word "still" the way he had described. And below it, in a separate message, 13 this year. She sat with her phone in her hands in the apartment that had always felt like the right size for someone who did not invite people in, and thought about how the definition of the right size might have changed. She texted back "still." Then she put the phone down and picked up her jacket from the chair where she always left it, and she put it on. Not because she was going anywhere, just because she was the kind of person who sometimes needed the specific weight of something carried a long time to remind herself of what she already knew. The name inside the collar had not changed. It had not needed to. Silver Angel, given on a terrible night by people who needed something to call a voice in the smoke, carried for 4 years by a woman who thought she had left it behind. And now not left behind, not discarded, just integrated the way the truest things integrate, not into the story you tell about yourself, but into the person you already are, whether or not anyone is telling the story. Roy Baines' wife, Helen, had met her for lunch 2 weeks earlier. Helen was 61 years old and direct in the way of someone who has no patience for indirectness and has stopped pretending otherwise. She had looked at Victoria across the table and said, "Roy told me you were modest about what you did. I told him that's not the same thing as not knowing the value of it." Victoria had looked at her. "What did he say?" "He said you seemed like someone who understood the difference between needing credit and needing purpose," Helen said. And then he said he thought you'd found your purpose a long time ago, and the credit was just catching up. Victoria had thought about that for a long time since. The credit catching up, not the purpose changing the credit, arriving at a destination the purpose had already reached. She had been Silver Angel for 4 years before anyone knew where to find her. The name was just language for something that had already been true. She sat in her apartment on a Friday evening in October with her jacket on and thought about Ethan, who was scheduled to testify in the Pullman preliminary hearing the following week. She thought about Dennis preparing him. She thought about Ethan at the defendant's table in his pressed shirt, holding himself together from the inside, and how he would look next week on the other side of that table as a witness, not a defendant, telling the truth about what he saw in plain language to people who had the authority to do something with it. She thought about James Cole, who sent her a photo every week of something Rose had done. A drawing, a gap-toothed smile, a report card once, a blurry photo of a captured caterpillar held in small, careful hands, because he had decided that the woman who came to his door on a Saturday with coffee should know that the life she had protected had daily, ordinary, irreplaceable contents. She thought about Marcus, who sent a text every year on a specific date to 12 men and now to 13. She thought about the journalist's article, which had been reprinted in 4 outlets and which had generated more letters to the editor than any story that publication had run in 3 years. Almost all of them from people who described watching someone be judged before they were heard and what it had cost them, and why the story of the woman who had stood her ground in a courtroom in a worn leather jacket and refused to let that judgment be the final word felt like something they had needed to read. She thought about Judge Richard Whitmore, who had sent Dennis a formal letter the week after the hearing, acknowledging the procedural error of his initial instruction and requesting that it be included in the case record. Not because he had to, because he had decided that the right response to making a mistake publicly was to correct it publicly. That Victoria thought was a man learning something. That was worth something. On the morning of Ethan Cole's testimony, in the Pullman preliminary hearing, Victoria arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early. She wore the jacket. She sat in the gallery and she watched Ethan walk in, not with the pressed shirt and the folded hands and the 1,000-yard stare of someone bracing against impact, but upright, present with the particular quality of a person who has decided that the truth they carry is worth the weight of carrying it into a room and setting it down in front of strangers. He saw her when he came through the door. He stopped for 1 second. She gave him the nod, the same small nod she had given him from the witness stand the morning this began, and the one that said, "You have what you need. Use it." He nodded back. He walked to the witness chair and he sat down and he told the truth. He told it clearly. He told it without performance. He told it with the steady, detailed precision of someone who had been through enough in the past year to understand that precision was the most powerful thing he could bring to a room. He told the jury what he had seen in Pullman's warehouse 6 weeks before the assault on Creston Avenue, what he had witnessed moving through a loading dock in the early hours of a Thursday morning, what he had understood it to mean, and what had happened to him when Pullman understood that Ethan had seen it. He spoke for 1 hour and 14 minutes. When he finished and stepped down from the witness chair, he walked past the gallery on his way to the door and he stopped beside Victoria for 1 moment. He said very quietly, "How'd I do?" She looked at him. "You told the truth," she said. "That's always enough." He nodded. "My uncle says that's what you told him," he said, when he asked why you went into the building. "It's the same principle," she said. He almost smiled. Then he straightened and walked out. The Pullman case resolved 14 months later with a conviction on 5 of 6 counts. The racketeering charge was the one that mattered most. It carried the longest sentence and the broadest implications, touching the business structure that Pullman had built over a decade, and that had survived by relying on the gap between what people knew and what could be proved. Victoria testified 4 times in those 14 months. Each time she said the same thing she had said the first time in the same language, with the same clarity. She was not shaken under cross-examination. She was not intimidated by Pullman's lawyers, who were good and expensive and did exactly what Dennis had warned her they would do. They found every potential vulnerability in her professional history, and they probed it, and it held, because the truth was the truth, and it had not been constructed, and therefore could not be deconstructed. On the day the verdict came in, she was not in the courtroom. She was in the trauma unit in the middle of a shift, doing the work she showed up for, regardless of what else was happening in the larger shape of her life. Dennis called at 3:47 in the afternoon. She stepped into the hallway to take the call. 5 counts, he said. She leaned against the wall. Ethan, she said, outside the courthouse, Dennis said. He's okay. He's more than okay. James is with him. Good, she said. How are you? Dennis asked. She thought about it. She thought about the 14 months. The testimony, the preparation, the cross-examinations, the late evenings, going over evidence with Dennis and Kellner, the Saturday morning coffees at James's kitchen table, the text from Marcus, the photos of Rose. She thought about Helen Baines, who had become, without either of them particularly planning it, someone she called when the difficult parts of the difficult months became too heavy to carry alone. She thought about Roy, who had shown up at her hospital one afternoon with coffee and 2 sandwiches and no agenda just because he was in the neighborhood and thought she might need a sandwich. She thought about the warehouse fire, which she had spent 4 years not thinking about, and which she now thought about with the particular clarity of a thing that has been fully seen, not painlessly, but honestly, with the understanding that some nights change what you think is possible, and that living in the direction of that change is the only way to honor them. She thought about her mother. She thought, I know who I am. And that was the most complete answer she had ever had to any question anyone had asked her. I'm good, she said to Dennis. I'm genuinely good. You should be, he said. She put her phone back in her pocket and walked back into the trauma bay. There was a patient who needed her. There was always a patient who needed her. That was the nature of the work, and she had loved the nature of the work since the first day she understood what it required, and she loved it still unchanged on the other side of everything. She pulled on her gloves. She moved toward the next thing that needed her the way she had always moved, not because she was fearless, but because people were in there. That had always been reason enough, and it always